My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special, as we're joined by two distinguished educators. To my right is a person who's no stranger to the Cultural Caravan family, Miss Rabin Nickens. And next to her is Mr. Carland Washington. Welcome to Cultural Caravan.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
You know, most of us know Rabin has been here as a host, but they don't know that Rabin is an educator who has been working as a teacher and administrator for a number of years. And also, we're joined by you, Carland. You also are a veteran educator administrator.
Yes.
With the Department of Ed. And so we're very happy to have both of you, and Rabin wearing her educator administrator hat. I was very inspired by a book that both of you wrote, an article, a book entitled Racially and Ethnically Diverse Women Leading Education, where you both wrote an article entitled Authenticity and the Female African American School Leader. In that book, you talk a lot about various aspects of leadership. But before we go there, I just want to ask yourselves a question. As leaders, as educational leaders, how did you embark upon this research? Carland?
Well, I've been doing work with Rabin in the Department of Education for the past 5 years, and Rabin was actually presented with the opportunity to write for this book, and she invited me to co-author with her. I was familiar with a few female principals, very strong leaders, and Rabin is a very strong writer, and so we pulled our resources together to do some of this work together. And I'll let Rabin talk about the inspiration behind the ideas and the topic behind the book.
Yeah, and Carland's right. I mean, it definitely was a collaboration. The editors of the book, Terry Watson and Tony Normore, are both higher education professionals themselves, wanted to create a forum for female and male scholars to actually collaborate on research, which they've never done before, or don't do as often as they should. And I think one of the things that we both noticed, just from experiences as well as based on research, was that you had this trend where statistically African American women actually pursue leadership roles more than women of other groups. However, they're also more likely to feel the need to change their personas in order to succeed. So for example, there was a 2015 study by Essence Magazine that noted that 80% of African American women felt they needed to change the way they speak, their ideas, their dress even, in order to succeed, compared to more like 60% of non-Hispanic white women. So why was this? You know, why was this phenomena happening? And could we relate it to the field that we're familiar with, which is education? Because most of the research was based on, you know, the corporate field, nonprofits, things of that nature.
Now, you mentioned something about, and I know you refer to as shifting, as people say, that, you know, and particularly, and as I mentioned, we talked, that the whole perception that as a person of African ancestry in a particular position, sometimes you feel the need to adapt. You know, people adapt maybe the way they speak, the way they do things. Like, for example, you don't use the slang or the quote-unquote black English or the Creole, the patois. You're because of what? You want to fit in. And certainly, I see the topic, and that's what fascinated me, could really be discussed by any particular industry, whether education, you know, a big business. It's definitely something that impacts us all. Now, let's talk about some of the things. As you started to do the research, Carland, what were some of the challenges you faced as you were trying to really unlock this information?
So it's interesting. You have, there's a lot of black female principals, but a few of them were a little hesitant to speak to us because they didn't know where this information was going to go or how they were going to be portrayed in this book. And so we found it challenging because we reached out to about many people did we reach out to, Rabin?
I'd say at least 25.
At least 25 people, and then we had 9 respondents who said that they would agree to speak to us. And so that was a challenge of itself, that we, so little research out here, and we wanted to get as many perspectives as we possibly could. And so that was the most challenging part about it. And Rabin and I met on several occasions to pull together some of the information that was gleaned from our conversations and our interviews, and trying to understand exactly what is connecting these women together. And so I think those were the most challenging parts, is people reluctant to speak to us and also trying to piece together the different conversations that we were having to create this book.
Now, as you started to talk, first of all, building that trust to know, look, this is not going to go back to my superintendent, blah, 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 but this is what this is what I'm perceiving. Give me an idea of the range of experiences that these women had as educators. How many years are we talking about collectively?
So you had one principal who had only been in leadership for 2 years, and you had another principal who had been a principal for about 20 years in the same building. And so it ranged and it varied, and the responses from the novice principal definitely differed from the one that was more experienced.
Rabin, what did you think?
Yes, and they also ranged in terms of age. I mean, we had administrators that were as young as 29 and some as old as in their 60s, from elementary to middle school. We didn't, get to focus as much on high school. And I just want to note that just that term shifting, that term was not coined by us. That was just to give credit to Dr. Shorter Gooden and Ms. Cherise Jones. Yes, who did a study and a book that's based on that. But they gave a word for that whole idea of you having to feel like you can't be exhibit your genuine behaviors that you feel more comfortable with, and then to kind of put on a mask, as they say, and to do something else. So, when we actually approached this research and talked to these women, that was some of the information that we presented them with. Like, okay, so here's what we found out in other industries. Is that the case for you? And if so, how do you deal with this?
Mm-hmm. Now, in addition to that, what were some of the trends that you uncovered as you started to really peel the onion and see where they're setting? What were some of the trends? Anyone like to?
I would say for the most part, these women were very mission driven. They felt it was their calling to be educators, and what propelled them into leadership was the fact that they didn't see it happening while they were teachers or paraprofessionals or teacher assistants. And so they wanted to get into leadership so that they can create a school where they felt that children would be welcome, and that they wanted to show that I can be a leader as well. Leaders don't just have to be white men or white women, they can be black females as well. And I'm a former social studies teacher, and I think back to Harriet Tubman, who was one of my most favorite people in history, a woman who was not very educated, but she possessed all of these same skills that these principals had. She was unapologetic. She was very mission-driven. She did exactly what she wanted to do. She didn't worry about anybody trying to get in her way. She was never caught. Nobody ever stopped her from doing what she needed to do. And so thus, what I found to be very similar with these principles is that, this black female leadership has been around for years and years, but nobody really talks about it in that way. Most of the information about black women is about how they're not doing well or what's wrong with the black community. And so, this is what we found from women that we interviewed. It was a beautiful thing to listen to their stories.
The interesting thing is when you were talking to women who said that the students and the parents had a hard time accepting them as leaders. That was the interesting thing. Maybe you can share some of the insights into that, because I just thought that was very...
Yeah, I mean, we have a section of the chapter called, Black Like Me, and also, you don't look like a principal, because you're right. I think sometimes people think these trials and tribulations or the microaggressions that these black women in leadership face are gonna come from someone who is not African American, but sometimes they had to deal with challenges from their own people of the same ethnicity. And that just goes to speak to probably just a broader issue about how we, as a community, as a collective, perceive what is supposed to be somebody that's intelligent or somebody that has certain acumen or expertise in a certain area. And, some of them, they had stories where, for example, somebody came up to one of our school leaders and said, you know what, my wife, she's been taking a few courses, at the center or something, and she wants to know how she can get one of those jobs. So, I mean, clearly, this person really was looking out for their wife, and they probably really looked up to this school leader. But unbeknownst to them, they were also kind of implying that if you have this role as a black woman, it must be pretty easy to get because, we don't really see or are used to black women in these roles. So how does that, that could have potentially made that school leader feel diminished, that black woman in leadership feel diminished. Yet, again, part of what we discovered in our research is that actually the black women that we researched actually contradicted some of the other research in regards to them feeling, depressed. Like these were some of the, the former research, depressed, having anxiety, all sorts of illnesses. None of these school leaders, these black female leaders, experience any of that. Interestingly enough, even when confronted with some of these.
So the interesting thing is, even though you did the research, you also looked at the what do you call it? The research of others, and you actually found that things weren't exactly the way people said, that just basically based on what was going on when that research was initially done 10, 15, 20 years ago versus the research you did recently, that things were not exactly the same. And you actually had people who were practitioners saying, look, this is not exactly the way it was. And, another thing is the history, the history of white supremacy, the history of racism, how unfortunately we still have to deal with these attitudes, whether they're attitudes from others outside of our community or even people within our community who unfortunately feel inferior and feel, oh, who are you? Who are you trying to act? You're acting like you're not enough, So you're dealing with all those other issues. So that's the interesting thing that you unlocked as you start to deal with some of the things that these women had to deal with, stereotypes and so forth. Now, as you started to talk to them, tell me about what were the 5 things that the major challenges in terms of being their authentic selves. What were some of the things that they had, the challenges they had?
I would say one of them was being labeled the angry black woman. That is a term that is used in American culture to describe black women. Any woman who is asserting themselves, any woman who is, giving out directions or, being a leader in some capacity, if it's something that you disagree with, then she becomes the angry black woman. And that's something that these women kind of feared going into their work, but also used to their strength.
And as Carland said, the angry black woman is definitely one of the archetypical stereotypes that these black female leaders had to deal with. But also the whole idea of them doing what any other woman in leadership would do: dress professionally, speak with standard English, but also sometimes speaking in colloquialisms and things of that nature, wearing certain types of shoes, having their hair done a certain way. And these things that women in other industries would do and be praised for: oh, you look so professional, oh, you seem ready for work, oh, you look like a leader, they're sometimes perceived, even by people in their community, as uppity, or, oh, you're trying to be better than us, or something of that nature. Or maybe if they're dealing with a white populace, because we had, a few school leaders that actually had white constituents, or in a higher level having to deal with people outside of their culture, oh, perhaps an intimidation factor, because, oh, now you're coming off as very important, and perhaps people have not perceived you that way. So that was another thing, another trend that we saw. But I do want to mention the fact that ultimately, as we discussed earlier, we found that these women did contradict the research, and we found that one thing that was a trend across was their ability to do this, to go from, direct and assertive when they needed to be, and then be very caring and come off as very considerate of their staff, of their students, things of that nature, of the families, and that not seeming to be something that was outside of their nature. And so we noticed that there wasn't a term for that, so we came up with Black Female Leadership Verisimilitude, or BFLV. And the reason why we say that is because we want people to know that there is another aspect of our community out there. There isn't just this one story, as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie would say, there isn't just one story. There's these other stories out there, and we want people to know that perhaps they can leverage that in the things that they do, no matter what industry they're in. It's just that we just happen to put it in the context of education.
Now, you also talk about some of the things that Black women in leadership can do to ensure their success. Carland, what are some of those things they can do?
Well, they just have to stay true to themselves. You know, you came into education for a reason, because you wanted to educate children. You want to help to construct America's future and everybody else's future for that matter. And so just stay true to your mission. You know why you came into this game, so to speak, and so do what you signed up to do, and then you don't have to worry about that. Everybody's going to have a conversation. Everybody's going to have a criticism of you, but you can't worry about that. You have to be unapologetic in your work for our children, because at the end of the day, either we're going to take care of them now, or we're going to have to take care of them later. And so if we signed up to take care of them now, then we should do that. And so I think that's one of the ways that they can do that. And they also have to stop worrying about what they're looking like and what the perception is that they carry. You know, to piggyback on Rabin's point, you know, one of the stories is that you had a principal who served predominantly lower income families. Students were coming from public housing. And so when she walked into these projects with her suit on, then people would say, oh, you think you're too good, or you think you're too pretty. So she says, fine, I'll put on some sweatpants and I'll put on some sneakers, and then I'll come over here. I'll still have the same message. Your child needs to come to school. And so you have to be unapologetic and stay mission-driven. Utilize your support systems around you, your family, your friends, your spouses, your partners, and do what you set forth to do.
Well, on that note, I want to really thank you both for sharing some very important information that can really support us, whether we are in education or any corporate America or any particular field where we're up against stereotypes. And as you know, being that we had the first African-American president as well as First Lady, we saw it in the world stage how they constantly had to prove themselves, but they did it with such dignity and grace. So I think they were an excellent example of how we have to, continue to keep our head held high. And again, I want to credit the work, which is racially and ethnically diverse women leading education. And I want to thank you both for joining us. Thank you. If you would like to support these broadcasts, we encourage you to send contributions to P.O. Box 300851, Jamaica, New York 11430. Thank you. Let's welcome Joe Patan.
They jumping in the city, West Indian happy, happy whole time. For Lebanon. I tell you, no problem, for we take over Harlem Sunday, eve of Labor Day. Virgin Islands crew in town, St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John. When you hear the cowbell ring, Harlem will be jumping. Hey, hey, Carnival, hey, hey, Bacchanal, hey, hey, Carnival, oh yeah. Virgin Islands in town for Labor Day. The action will be heavy, people from the
I realized that to learn about the people, you study the dance. And when you study the dance, you learn the history of the people, because dance in traditional African cultures used to preserve, and so that the young coming forth learn by age group. And as I said, you know, I'm skipping years. In traditional African cultures, you learn by age group. So you would have the toddlers who will be going around, they aren't paying any attention, but they are, because these rhythms are becoming a part. And then as they go into the initiation rites, everything is explained. Then after the initiation, then they are ready for courtship and marriage, and then maybe baby naming ceremonies, and on and up until time they make the transition to the grand ancestral grounds.
us about the importance of celebrating this legend and her family's commitment?
Well, the longevity of it, the quality, the non-negotiable dignity, that's kind of what Ruby and Asa represented. I remember as a child in South Carolina when Jack Robinson was the ultimate hero for all of us, the great breakthrough, Ruby and Jack Robinson doing the Jack Robinson story. That was a big deal. There were no black anchors on TV at that time, none, anywhere in America. So the forerunner on screen, on stage, but their stardom did not take them into another world. It took them to the ground where the people were. In so many ways, Oz and Ruby are like reality TV. They're like real stuff. What you see is what you get. And whether it was marching in Selma, Alabama with Dr. King, also doing Malcolm X's funeral, calling him Sweet Prince. I mean, this Asa, I remember the first Black Caucus meeting, after Dr. King had been killed, and we were searching for our way. We lost this huge giant. It was Asa Davis who says, not the rap is the map, not the man's the plan. That's Asa too.
Eternal evil of slavery is the self-hatred that it has engendered in African people. We don't identify as being black. In order for you to improve the condition of black people have to first identify primarily as being black. You can be Christian, but I'm a black who happens to be Christian. I'm an African who happens to be Muslim. You understand? I'm an African who happens to be a Mason. I'm an African who happens to belong to a fraternity or a sorority. We don't identify as black first. Chinese do, Asians do, Latinos do, East Indians do. They identify with their race of origin first. That is primary, not for us, because we hate ourselves. Politicians know this, so they can speak to us as what I'm going to do for the church, what I'm going to do for the teachers, what I'm going to do for this particular contingency, because they know black people would rather identify with some lesser affiliation than with their primary racial affiliation.